Today, what I'm going to do is start with just a little bit of personal background and dealing with a few concepts around culture and global fitness. And then really what I want to do is to look at a particular critical incident that actually happened in China and do some analysis of it. And then talk about how you could apply this framework, the TRIPS framework, in real life. And then I'll give you some suggestions for follow-up reading if you're interested. So, like Kanjian said, my first time was in Hong Kong many years ago. And at that time, I'd recently graduated from university. I had actually no idea about anything about Chinese culture. And I actually was going to learn Chinese at the time. And on my way at lunchtime, shortly after I arrived in Hong Kong, I went to the bank. And was, as I say, round about lunchtime, and it was a young clerk, male, similar age to myself, and we did the transaction. And then he said to me, "Have you had lunch?" And I was really surprised because in British way of thinking, that's a preliminary to an invitation. I thought he's a complete stranger. So I said, yes, I've had lunch, thank you. And thought that's strange, and went on to the school. And as I was walking in, met one of the teachers, and she said, "Have you had lunch?" And I thought, why is everybody asking me this? And because the next few days, everyone was saying the same thing. And I thought, oh, it must be because I'm too thin, and they were concerned about my health. Of course, later I realized that this was just a greeting. Another occasion that happened very soon after I went to Hong Kong, a family invited me to their home, and as soon as we came in, they just poured me a cup of tea. And I tasted it, and I thought, oh gosh, this is really bitter. And in my British way, I thought, well, I don't want to be rude. I'd better drink up the cup of tea, and then I can relax. But of course, as I drank it, they filled it again, and I drank and they filled it. And I was saying, no, thank you. No, thank you. And they kept pouring. And I was getting desperate. I didn't know how to stop them. Eventually, I put my hand over the cup of tea, almost got scolded. And that again made me realize that language, culture are very closely interconnected. So what do we mean by culture? In a lot of the language curriculum, it's interpreted as sort of products or practices, festivals, clothing, this kind of thing. And it's usually actually quite separated from language learning and use. But in our work, we like to, in a very simple way, think of culture as the 3 Ps of culture. So if we thought of a Chinese banquet, you've got the physical features, the type of food, the chopsticks, etc. So there are physical features, and these are the products. And we can look and think, oh, yes, that's Chinese food, for instance. But then there are ways of doing things. So, for example, how to use chopsticks, whether people are served, whether the guest is served with the food by somebody else, where people sit, and so on. And so there are ways of doing things. And actually, that's a common definition that some people use about culture, the way we do things around here. And then the third layer is perhaps the perspectives, those underlying beliefs and attitudes. So, for instance, where do people sit at the table? In the West, it's not always very prescribed, but we've got things like hierarchy and roles and responsibilities. So the most important guest is placed here, and the lesser important guest is, and so on. So these are three aspects of culture, but they're all interconnected. We can see the products and we can see the practices, but we don't always know how to interpret them. So if you think of my example with the tea, I was saying, no, thank you, no, thank you. That was having no effect, because what does it mean to be a good host? A good host is to always give the visitor as much as they want. And so there was that communication gap. And this is where, if we think, how does communication work? A traditional model is what's known as the message model, which would be, I say something and I have an idea, I put it into language, and then I speak. And so long as there's not too much interference, the next person can decode and get the meaning. But in fact, that's not always the case. As we said, I was saying, no, thank you, but it wasn't being accepted. Why? What happens is what I mean is not necessarily what the other person understands. That's because we always draw on this background contextual information. So, what does it mean to be a good host was influencing that host's behavior towards me. I was thinking, what does it mean to be a good guest? But then when there are cultural differences in how we fulfill those roles, then we may get that misunderstanding. So in communicating across cultures, then we've got three key features: language and meaning making. You've got cultural patterns, and all of those will influence relationships. And we need to pay attention to all of them. So you may have wondered, somebody asked me recently, why do you call it global fitness? Well, really, because when you say intercultural competence, most people have no idea what that means. And we think also that the notion of global fitness conveys the need, you always need to be paying attention. We're never, just as we're never always permanently physically fit, we have to keep exercising, etc. So we're not ever fully interculturally competent. We always need to have that ongoing attention. And also, like with fitness, there are different aspects. There's the muscle development. There's the other aspects of building strength and endurance and so on. And so similarly with intercultural competence, there are those different aspects to it. So we'd see it as a kind of cycle. So you've got the skills, qualities, and values that we need to be able to work well. And then there's the steps and the things that we can do to help grow. But then there's also the environment and the context that we need to foster it. So in a moment, I'm going to share a critical instance. So just briefly, what are critical incidents? Actually, although it's called critical incidents, they're not necessarily individual incidents. They might be actually a sequence of events or episodes. And they're not necessarily critical in the medical sense. It's more that they are revelatory or significant in some way. So if any of you are researchers and you want to actually use critical incidents to get data, etc. I did a live set of seminars recently on the platform Instats, and you can, if you're interested in that, it will be available on demand probably from the end of this month. What's my aim for today? So I want to show how intercultural learning, global fitness, can be gained from critical incidents. I want to give you a framework, which I've called TRIPS, that can be used to support this learning. And that framework, I think, helps us understand why and how misunderstandings can occur, both in message meaning and in interpersonal rapport. And it's useful for understanding and supporting positive relationships. We've also found that it's very useful for teachers and trainers to help others handle the interpretation process. And we also find it's relevant in a wide range of situations and cultural contexts. In other words, it's not specific to any particular national culture or language. That was quite a long introduction. So now I'm going to turn to actually learning from critical incidents and share a particular critical incident that actually one of my students, former students, shared with me. Concerned volunteering at an international summer camp in China with primary school children. So I'll read it out. A group of participants, that's primary school children and their teachers, were due to arrive one morning and have classes in the afternoon. Actually, they didn't arrive until the early evening. One of the Chinese volunteers, Xiao Li, was told to take two of the international volunteer teachers to meet the children and say hello to them. She did so. Just to note, Xiao Li had already started to develop a friendship with these volunteer teachers. So the international teachers introduced themselves to the children, spent a few minutes with them, and then they planned to leave. However, the camp organisers wanted the teachers to stay longer and kept asking them to interact more with the children. The two teachers were annoyed because they didn't think they should stay that long. The staff from the school were not pleased either. So afterwards, one of the volunteer teachers, international teachers, said to Xiao Li, "Be careful when you speak to Western people. When you ask us to say hello to the children, we just say hello. If you want us to give a class, we need preparation, and then we can give a really good one." Xiao Li commented, "I was surprised upon hearing her words. Although I didn't say anything, I felt a bit annoyed and frustrated." So, what went wrong? Everyone was upset and annoyed. Why was that? So I want to show how the TRIPS framework can actually help us consider this from the different people's perspectives. So what is TRIPS? So it's an acronym: triggers, reactions, interactions, people, settings. And these in linguistics and pragmatics are sort of summarizing the key elements that are involved in an interaction. And as you see, I've put interactions right in the center. That's the heart of things. What is said and done, or it could be what's not said and done. And then those interactions can trigger reactions. And they're all influenced by the context, the people who are there, and the settings. So if we start, we think first of all about the interactions. As I say, interactions are what people say and do or don't say and do. So in this case, they were asked to say hello. Now, when we talk about meaning, actually in linguistics, there's multiple meanings. So you could say, what is the language code meaning of this? In other words, like the dictionary meaning. But then you've also got the contextual meaning, what those words mean in that context, taking that background information into account. But you could also say the functional meaning, what those words mean in terms of behavior. So if we analysed it like that, Xiao Li and the international volunteers were interpreting it very similarly. Language code meaning, say hello, is just what it means, say hello. Contextual meaning, meet the children briefly. Functional meaning, introduce themselves briefly to the children. Camp organisers, though, seem to have a rather different interpretation. So meet the children, yes, but not necessarily briefly. And they actually wanted the volunteers to teach an initial class, not just briefly say hello. So then we might say, well, what were the reactions? And with reactions, we can think of emotional reactions and evaluative reactions, rude, competent, or whatever. So camp staff reactions, we're told they were irritated, annoyed. We weren't told about the evaluative reactions, presumably thinking incompetent, not responsible, something like that. The international teachers' reactions towards Xiao Li and the camp organisers, they were annoyed. And again, no detail given on their evaluations, but certainly they seem to be negative. And then the international volunteer, if we go on and think the next thing she said, be careful when you speak to Western people. When you ask us to say hello to the children, we just say hello. If you want us to give a class, we need preparation, and we can then give a really good one. So Xiaoli's reaction towards all of this, she was annoyed, frustrated, offended, embarrassed, but she covered up her emotions. She said, I didn't show anything. And she felt that she had been blamed unfairly. So then we might want to dig a little deeper. So the Western volunteers implied it was culture to blame. When you speak to Westerners, implying Chinese and Westerners could be different. So I think if we go into the TRIPS analysis, we can understand more clearly why everyone was upset. And here I want to introduce you to the notion of triggers. This one here, these are things that trigger those reactions. Whatever happens in the interactions that upset us in some way or annoy us. So there are 6 of them. I've called them the GAF triggers, and I'm just going to briefly go through each of them. First of all, there's goals. We all want to achieve things. So you will have your goals for coming to this webinar. If it doesn't meet your expectations, you may feel a bit annoyed. Then we have autonomy. None of us like to be bossed round inappropriately. On the other hand, we sometimes like to be given clear direction. So autonomy is a dimension going from control to freedom. And we often need to have different preferences on that scale. Attention. None of us like to be ignored. On the other hand, we don't like too much attention. If it comes to the Q&A and somebody picked on you, you might feel you didn't want that attention. Face. I don't think I need to explain too much with that. We all want to be respected and appreciated. We want to be treated fairly, and we want there to be ethical principles in the way things are handled. Any of you want to follow up on that? Some of this comes from interpersonal pragmatics. I did an article just recently which explains that. For those of you with more of a psychology background, it also comes from interpersonal psychology, 2 key dimensions: autonomy versus control, involvement versus non-involvement. Lots of references to follow up on that as well. Let's move on and then see how we could apply those GAF triggers to the that little incident that we'd looked at. So I've got here the 6 triggers, and each of us would have those same those sensitivities. If there's alignment between them, then usually the rapport will be smooth. If there's misalignment, then there may be a problem with rapport. So here we're just looking at the camp organizers and the international volunteers. So the camp organizers, their goals would be a positive experience for the participants. In other words, for the primary school children and their teachers. For the international volunteers, they also wanted to perform well, but as volunteers that everyone would appreciate them. So in many respects, their goals were aligned. However, when we look here, the camp organizers were expecting the volunteers to follow their instructions, to do as they were told. Whereas the international volunteers were prioritizing more the autonomy. They were not expecting their time to be controlled. They thought you said, say hello. We've said hello. Now you're trying to control us over and above that. They had a concern about the sense of fairness, lack of notice, lack of clear instructions. And then that they threatened their teaching competence. So it was like a threat to their face. So you can see that actually whilst their goals were aligned, they were misaligned in these other areas. Then if we go back to this, be careful when you speak to Western people. When you ask us to say hello to the children, we just say hello. If you want us to give a class, we need preparation, and we can give a really good one. You can see there their sort of sensitivity to how they had performed. But Xiaoli's reflection, she says, my frustrations mainly for 3 reasons. I considered myself to be innocent, since I was just doing what I was told and shouldn't be the one to be blamed. I'd spent some time with the foreign teachers. I thought I'd built some friendship with them, well, particularly with this one, but her words were to some extent offensive and really hurt my feelings. I was also embarrassed that the situation was not handled well by our organizer. Those were what my student wrote. So if we now think in terms of those follow-up comments, we think of, again, the international volunteers, Xiaoli, and then over here, the camp organizers. So Xiaoli felt it was not her fault. So this was an issue of fairness from her point of view. There was also the issue of face. She felt that she had been personally criticized when it wasn't her fault, but she also felt face threat in terms of the camp organizers because it seemed to show them in a bad light. But if you look at it from the international volunteers' point of view, why did they say that? Obviously, I don't know for sure, but my interpretation is to reduce the risk of unclear instructions in the future and its impact on teaching quality. So to me, they were trying to say, okay, yeah, we were upset about what happened. We're going to tell you this, speak to us clearly so that we don't have the problem again. So again, you can see quite a mismatch there in the triggers. So what are the implications? I would say people may prioritize the rapport risk factors differently. For instance, the relative importance of goal achievement versus autonomy. They may interpret one or more of the risk factors differently. For example, what counts as fair? What's fair to you may not be fair to me. And these kinds of differences are likely to be more pronounced in global contexts. So that's why everyone needs to be mindful of their own and others' interpretations and prioritizations of the GAF rapport risk factors and need to take them into account. Okay, so we've had a thought about the interactions, say hello, and the misunderstandings that took there, and the follow-up comment that one of the volunteer teachers said. We looked at their reactions. We looked at some of the mismatches in their misalignments in those trigger factors. But we also need to take into account the context, the people, and the settings. So let's think about the people. Typically, we'd be thinking, what about the number of people, nationalities, personalities, international experience? So here I'm going to ask, how relevant was the nationality there? Interestingly, Xiaoli and the camp organizers, they're all Chinese, but they had a misunderstanding together. Then we might look at participant relations, hierarchical, unequal. There were people in boss position. Distance, closeness. Xiaoli was disappointed that the international volunteers didn't take this into account. They were treating her as though she was a sort of relative stranger, one of the others. And then you've got role responsibilities, levels of authority, work-related rights and obligations. The camp organizers felt they had the right to give instructions to the volunteers. Understandable, but it was clearly the volunteers felt that was not totally the case. And then if we think of settings, now often in the intercultural, people are thinking at the national setting, by country, but actually setting is multi-layered. And one of the most important ones is actually this one in the center, the actual communication context, because every type of communication, whether it's a meeting or a social event, has some norms and practices associated with it. So here we'd got an international summer camp. So we'd need to ask ourselves, what are the normal arrangements for this type of community event? How is the teaching arranged? Are there any rules or conventions? When I first saw this example, I was really surprised because I thought these were primary school children. They'd been traveling all day and they would be tired. Why would you give them a lesson in the evening of that day? So this was part of my lack of understanding, perhaps, of how an international summer camp in China works. Normally, we'd think of an organizational setting. So like in a department or something, what's the culture of that organization? This one, though, is presumably a sort of temporary one set up just for the summer camp. So what does it mean in terms of hierarchy, autonomy, time management? Clearly, I didn't know that. And then we've got the national setting, China, location, we don't know. But normally, we would want to have background information on this so that we can make more interpretations. So hopefully, you can see from that actually the incident was originally put across as an intercultural incident, but we could see it's more complex than that. It's not just a question of national culture. There are lots of other factors involved. So let's see how we could apply that more in real life. So starting with interactions, as I said, interactions is what's said or not said, and it covers things like the message content. In other words, what is the message that's is getting across? You've got the communication style. Is it very direct? Is it indirect, friendly, or what? You've got the communication dynamics, things like the turn taking and so on. There will always be kind of differences, especially in communication style, directness, indirectness, both within and across languages. So you see, one of the main problems here was actually the misunderstanding in the message content, perhaps because of the communication style. And as we also noted, Xiao Li, she was Chinese, but she misunderstood what the camp organizers meant. So here are some things that are quite important to use. So we would say, check the clarity of the language, comprehension check, ask questions if you're speaking to check what that the other person is understanding. Do you follow what I mean, for instance? You could, if you don't understand somebody else, you might ask for repetition if you haven't heard it, or ask them to say pardon or something. Then looking the other way around, clarification request, ask for further explanation of something that's not clear. What do you mean by such and such? Or confirmation check, ask for confirmation that one's heard something clearly. Do you mean such and such? Or then somebody would say, let it pass, just ignore the problem. Sometimes we have to do that, but it can be dangerous if we do that continuously. So if we go on and think here, neither Xiao Li nor the camp organizers carried out any meaning check. There was no comprehension check. The camp organizers didn't ask Xiao Li, do you follow what I mean? Do you understand what I want them to do? Xiao Li didn't ask for clarification to what do you mean by, that's a bit blunt, but perhaps you say, okay, she might have asked, how long are you expecting the volunteers to stay? So she really should have carried out clarification requests or confirmation checks. And I found that actually in our own work, with graduated students who are having problems in their workplace, they have, maybe their boss has asked them to do something or told them to do something. They may not be very clear, but they don't go through these clarification requests, which is very normal, especially worded sensibly. And then if there's a misunderstanding and the work isn't done properly, you get into these relationship problems like we saw in this particular case study. So, as I say, carrying out meaning checks are really, really helpful and important. So that's paying attention. Obviously, I can't go through everything in this short time, to the interactions, how to minimize the risk of a misunderstanding. Misunderstandings do occur, and we will sometimes have reactions. Managing our emotions, it's important to do that to prevent them festering. And I'm sure you all know, if something happened, we ignore it afterwards, we go over it, and we can get more annoyed and angry with the other person. One of the things is in emotional intelligence, they would say, is to actually clarify the emotions for yourself. And that in itself can help to reduce their intensity, but also understanding different people's perspectives, going through using the trips and the triggers in particular to see other people's perspectives in itself can also help reduce those emotions and adjust our evaluations. So if you're interested in that, in our book, we have got a little framework to help with the emotion side. Then I would say, as I've just indicated, use the triggers to check on what was really upsetting you, what might have been upsetting the other person. As I say, this helps you understand why you and the other person was upset, whether there was any misalignment. It can reduce the risk of cultural stereotyping, always just jumping and saying, oh, it's a cultural issue. And it's useful for language and behavior planning. So you might think, okay, I've got my goals, but what about other people's goals? How can I take them into account? What about autonomy versus control? How much, if you're the leader, how much am I controlling the other person which they're not happy with? Or am I giving them too much freedom so they don't know what to do? What about attention or inclusion? Am I including everybody in an equal way? Am I ignoring some people? Sometimes if people see that somebody from outside their group, they feel they just don't talk to them. And so that person can easily feel excluded. And then, of course, that also brings in questions of face, things like level of directness of criticism, treating people as fairly as possible, upholding ethical standards. I've been quite surprised, really, again, some of my former students who've been asked or told to do things, even in university context, which are clearly unethical. And then they're put in a very awkward situation. So all of these trigger factors need to be paid attention to so that you can try to think your own position, the other person's position, and try to see where you're aligned or where you are misaligned. And then, of course, it's the context, the people, the settings. Why analyze that? Well, as we've seen, it has a crucial influence on the interpretation of meaning. Things like these people factors, hierarchy, distance, closeness, sense of role, responsibilities. These actually can be quite different across cultures. When I was in China teaching there, the sense of what it meant to be a teacher and the teacher-student relationship was very different from what I was familiar with in Britain. And notions of hierarchy can be very different, distance, closeness. And of course, the setting factors. And as I say, particularly this notion of communicative events, like meetings or wherever, who can talk when. These are all very culturally based, not particularly national culture based, but also organizational culture based. Now, those of you who are familiar with the intercultural field will know that there's a set of guide sort of tools, you could say, and where some have called it die, some have called it day, odis, we called it the 3R, which is basically 3 steps. And the first is to describe objectively what goes on, or what happened. Not as easy, by the way, to do it as objectively as you might think. And then the next step is to interpret or analyze or reflect on what happened. And what we found was that actually our students, okay, they were could develop quite well how to describe something objectively, especially with some training, but they struggled with the analysis or the reflection because they didn't really know what to reflect on. And that was one reason why we also came up with the TRIPS framework, because it gave or gives people some pegs of some things to look at and that they can reflect on. So we put it into the reaction management tool: record, reflect, reassess, the 3R, note down the facts of what happened using TRIPS as a guide, reflect on why it happened and reasons for your reactions, particularly using the triggers. And then you would reconsider your interpretation and reactions in the light of that TRIPS analysis. So if you're interested in that, in our book, actually, we have a lot of tools that guide you through those different steps. So if you're feeling upset or annoyed, you've got the reaction management tool. If you've got conflict and disagreement, we have a discord management tool. If you're feeling silenced or excluded in meetings, we have a participation management tool, especially for leaders. And then ones for getting on with your colleagues or problems with your boss, or if you're a leader, how to be a supportive leader. And all of them are built around the TRIPS framework. Okay, so rush through that quite quickly. If you are interested, both of our books, recent books, Global Fitness for Global People, Making Working Relationships Work, both of them are full of authentic stories, cases, critical incidents. We have tools and activities for learning and development. Each chapter ends with key takeaways. We've tried to use as little jargon as possible and hopefully useful for the teachers and trainers, etc. If you want more detailed reading, yes, that really explains TRIPS in more detail. You can download a free copy of Chapter 1 from our website. And then recently I've done 2 journal articles, both of which are open access. This one, Rapport and Intercultural Interaction, is a relatively straightforward one. This Journal of Pragmatics is a more academic approach to it. And then finally, I have a little YouTube channel. So I've got 2 up there here on this topic: Managing Rapport and Intercultural Interaction. That was a keynote talk I gave for the China Association for Intercultural Communication last year. And then last month, I gave one on if nation-based models of culture are inadequate, where next? So if you're interested in those, just go to my YouTube channel. And now that brings us to the end. So if you have any questions now, or if you want to learn more, want some of those references, just feel free to get in touch with me. So I'm now going to stop sharing and hand back over to Kantian for the Q&A session.
Thank you so much, Helen, for the most fascinating, sort of very insightful talk about your experiences, especially your analysis and the tools you provide. So I'm sure there will be lots of questions in the audience. Zoe, please.
Thank you very much for the very insightful talk and sharing all these resources. It's super. I have one question. What I experience, I'm an intercultural trainer and I work also as a lecturer at the university. When it comes to questioning what do you mean by, for example, what does it mean to say hello? What I experience very often is that it even doesn't come to the mind of the people that they should ask the question.
Exactly.
And because they, myself included, sometimes we are so convinced that that's the way you see it, and the other person will see it exactly the same way. So I would be interested to hear your thoughts about that. How do you go about that? How do you raise that awareness? Because evidently we cannot question everything, because otherwise probably communication gets a little bit complicated. Sure. So yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts on that. And thank you.
Yeah, hi Sylvia. Yeah, I mean, you're quite right. I mean, especially I think when the meaning seems obvious, like say hello just seems obvious. When I was managing some projects with China, and we were talking about a research project, and we went 2 days without really reaching any agreement, because none of us stepped back and said, what do you mean by research? Because we just, and I think there's no easy answer, except I think, because as you said, you can't always be doing this. But I think in this kind of situation, when the camp organizers were saying, tell them, get them to do this, or a boss I found, saying, do this. It's really important to actually just, when you're giving instructions, go back at that point and check. And all I can say is, it's not the default automatic reaction, but that's where I think, we're just trying to din it in, both to ourselves and to others, in key situations when there's something important. Check. Do a confirmation check. But we're all humans and we forget still. But then I suppose the next thing I would say is, so what happens often is that it doesn't happen, but then we blame the other. And so that's where we're sort of also hoping that actually by using trips, it encourages people to reflect. Actually, it wasn't just their fault. It was also my fault in different ways.
Thank you.
Do you want to ask a question, Zoe?
Hello, yeah. Thank you for the talk. So I'm a linguist, and I'm currently writing my MA thesis about intercultural communicative competence and going abroad, and students, supposedly, according to, the EU and most university faculties, when you do a study abroad placement, you magically somehow gain intercultural communicative competence. So I'm interviewing students about this, because in the universities that I'm looking at, or where I've had experiences, there aren't actually sort of training, pre-departure training in place for people. And I would just be really interested if you had any input on that, or if you could say anything about where you see the responsibility lies in universities for people gaining intercultural competence, or as you call it, global fitness.
If you go back to that little sort of diagram I had near the beginning, everybody has responsibility. So the kind of setting, the environment, the context. So universities have a responsibility, but then the students themselves in their engagement activities also need the responsibility to, do things like going out of their comfort zone and so on. So, but the reality is, not all universities are providing that. And of course, to some extent, if you cushion people too much, then you're preventing them get the experiences that they need of that discomfort, etc. I would also say we did some interviews, this is going back a few years, at Warwick, with students who perhaps had not too much training before going from different departments. And they were just saying, thank you so much for talking with us, because what often happens is, especially in university things, they go abroad, they've done their period, they come back, university is just moving on to the next stage, and they don't have time, they don't have that opportunity to talk through and reflect on those experiences. So it isn't just, I think, in advance. Ideally, you would also have, some contact whilst they're abroad. But when they come back, even more so, spend time helping them think and reflect on those experiences. And that will, well, certainly we found, it was a big experience for the students. They wanted people to be interested. And it was disappointing when university life just went on to the next module. Don't know if that helps much, but
thank you very much. Oh, that's great. Thanks.
Rosina.
Hello again, Helen, and thank you so much for that talk.
Rosina.
It's quite remarkable, Helen, how you managed to synthesize all those complex notions into a workable, practical, applicable framework for people to take with them and apply. Really fantastic. My question perhaps is a linguistic one, rather than, because it's very clear, crystal clear what you've presented, at least to me. How would your framework, as presented, or is there any need perhaps, I'm thinking of the hoof, to account for racializations such as the one you have in your data? When you talk to Western people,
yes,
that level of othering, which is beyond, I'm not too sure the volunteer, sorry, would that be within autonomy control? Because it's not so much an institutional power, if you like, that these people have got. In the example you presented, they're more or less on a par with each other. Right? The volunteer and the teachers, right? But the organizers, sorry, and the volunteer teachers. But of course, you then have in your chapter, more hierarchical relationships. But then there's sort of the power of the ideological thing there. How could that? Yeah.
So to me, those would go within people and settings. So within people, obviously I couldn't talk much about that today, but within people, you've got both the individual's personal characteristics, including their biases, their sense of identity, etc., all of which are coming into play. So things like stereotyping, all the othering, for me, that would be within their own people ideological sort of aspect. But then you've also got the setting where, well, take Britain at present with all the immigration sort of arguments. So if you have that broader sort of societal setting where you've got all that national debate going on, that's also going to impact on people and their own ideologies, etc. So to me, all of that is kind of underpinning and influencing what then goes on in the particular interaction, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Good.
I'm afraid we're running out of time. I just want to take this opportunity to promote our Chinese language modules and some very short online courses. So we have a accredited learning module which starts every October, and the registration starts in March 26th. And then our intermediate Chinese 30 credit module is coming next year. So registration will start in March as well. So with these two modules, you could combine with business management or law to get a certificate in higher education. And then we also have a suite of short online courses. Each one is only about 30 hours learning. And then there are some Chinese business culture essentials course in English, and also we have intercultural competence courses as well. So that's all in this page. If you Google Open University short courses, language short courses, you'll find quite a lot of them. And then finally, I'll let people know about our next public talk on Friday, January the 23rd. And it's about Chinese symbolism on museum objects, to be delivered by Dr. Zong Fang, and she's a museum professional in Chinese culture. And we have already put the Eventbrite page up, so if you want to register now, you could. So let me just finally say thank you so much, Helen, for this fascinating talk. So thank you again. Thank you, everybody, for engaging, for coming to the talk.
Many thanks to all of you for joining, and good to hear your feedback.